Well, hello and good evening, everybody. My name is Christian Thacker, and this video will serve as my initial post for this week's discussion as we look at psychopathology and the Christian worldview. So this week in our prompt, we were asked, based on your understanding of the Christian worldview, how would you define psychopathology? What does the Bible say about abnormality? And lastly, what is the secular view of abnormality? So first, I wanted to start off this discussion by answering the question, well, what is psychopathology? So basically, in basic terms, psychopathology is the scientific study of mental disorders or mental illness. So that's our basic definition of psychopathology. So with that in mind, how do we as Christians and as believers, myself included, define psychopathology? So I've taken some notes here. Basically, as Christians, we live in a fallen world. We live in a world that is full of sin, that is broken because of the original sin caused by Adam and Eve. So when we look at Romans chapter 5, verse 12, it says, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death spread to all men, because all sinned." So from this verse we see that in many ways, psychopathology can be considered from a Christian worldview as a byproduct of sin that has entered into the world because of the fall of man. Humans, in their very nature and their very condition, are broken individuals because of sin, and that has infested us as beings, as people, and also the world that we live in here today. An article that I found titled "Psychopathology Through the Eyes of Faith, Integrated Relations for Classroom and Beyond," they saw psychopathology as the study of the soul, of the study of the soul, pretty much the conditions of the soul, the things that afflict the soul, meaning that we are taught to learn how to assess and treat and prevent concerns that affect the whole person, the embodied soul. So basically, that's how this particular article phrased psychopathology, just the study of the different things that affect the soul, negative things that affect the soul. So when we take this into consideration for psychopathology, it gives us more of a holistic view of mental illness, as we understand that as Christian, there are spiritual factors that go along with and influence mental illness and mental disorders. Four main things that the DSM-5 focuses on is deviance, dysfunction, danger, and distress when it comes to mental disorders and psychopathology. But from this, we can also include one's soul and their soul care, where their soul is at. So to answer the question, how do Christians define psychopathology? We, as practitioners, as believers, agree with the scientific findings that it is dysfunction and distress from the normal, but also that there is an element of the soul there and of the fallen world element, that we live in sin and only God, and restoration and relationship with Him can fully help us through these circumstances. So when we jump down to the second question, we see that what does the Bible say about abnormality? So from a biblical perspective, abnormality may be considered any behavior that is the result of the fall of man or the sin nature, pretty much. That could be abnormality. So if behavior that aligns with the Word of God is normal, anything that deviates from that or is sin could be deemed as abnormal. So because of Adam and Eve, we are essentially alienated from God, and through the sacrifice of Jesus, we are restored with Him. But because of sin, we are separated from Him. So the consequences of this sin, unfortunately, is that creation, including us as human beings, are polluted, and that is a consequence of sin in the world and in our life. This includes man's body. We get physically sick, we have physical ailments, we get weary, and that's the same with our mind. We can become weary, we can have dysfunction, illness in the mind. So that is the same with the physical body as well, and the mind. In Psalms chapter 73, verse 26, it shares, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." And Psalms 13:2 shares, "How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my empty triumph over me?" So that passage basically points to a famous biblical character, David, and how he struggled with sadness and depression for many periods of his life. And the body, how the body can have ailments and fail, just as mentioned in Psalms, so can the mind. And we see that, like I said again, with the story of David, and how he struggled with certain things through his life. So despite sin, though, we can take heart as believers, knowing that God is the ultimate healer and provider in our lives, even when we struggle with these things. In 2 Corinthians, it talks about, in 2 Corinthians 12:9, it shares, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in your weakness." So even though we struggle with sin in the world, even though that affects our bodies and our minds, we can take heart knowing that God is sufficient enough, is our healer, is our provider, and all these things. So that's just some things to consider when we look at abnormality and the biblical perspective on that. Lastly here, guys, I just want to cover what the secular view of abnormality is. So basically, the World Health Organization defines mental disorders as significant disturbances in thinking, emotional regulation, or behavior. So there's a level of impairment in how one functions, and there's a lot of distress that comes from said impairment, including symptoms of mental illness. Depending on the type of illness someone suffers from, there accompanies that certain symptoms. So the DSM-5, which is basically the statistical manual of how we diagnose mental disorders, their categories, shares with us that abnormal behavior can cause dysfunction in cognitions, how we think, emotions, how we feel, and then in turn our behaviors, how we behave. Depending on the disorder, these may look different, but essentially it affects all these areas. This can make it hard for an individual to achieve well-being based upon their normal, objective, and subjective standards. With that, the DSM-5 also shares that abnormal behavior are behaviors that deviate from the normal or what is socially accepted, and again can cause a great deal of distress that may be debilitating in their lives. So that's how the secular view abnormality. Basically, it's a deviation that may cause distress or dysfunction in someone's life. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this post. Again, I hope everyone has a blessed week, and this will act as my initial post for this week's discussion module. Thank you so much, and have a blessed week.